At exactly 12:20 a.m., Ukraine launched a massive drone attack deep inside Russian territory. This was not a small raid or a limited strike. It was one of the largest drone operations ever carried out in the war. In total, 89 drones were launched at the same time in a single coordinated wave. The target was not just any military site. The target was Russia's $5.2 billion oil pipeline that runs through the Tver and Bryansk regions. This pipeline is one of the largest in the country, carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of refined fuel every day. That fuel is used to power Russian tanks, armored vehicles, and fighter jets. It also supplies key refineries that process energy exports to Europe and Asia. In other words, this pipeline is both a military lifeline and an economic artery. Destroying even part of it would be a huge blow to Moscow's war machine and its financial strength. The operation was planned with precision. Ukrainian drone operators waited for days until the weather, timing, and Russian defense posture gave them the perfect chance. On that night, skies were clear, but covered in a thin layer of fog, which gave cover for low-flying drones. The drones took off from multiple launch points, some from hidden bases inside Ukraine, others possibly from forward operating positions closer to Russian soil. Each group of drones was pre-programmed to fly at low altitude, weaving around radar detection zones. Some flew straight, others zigzagged, creating dozens of radar signatures across the map. The idea was to overwhelm Russia's surveillance systems. Within minutes of launch, Russian early warning radars began to pick up strange movements in the air. At first, they thought it was a small-scale attack, maybe a few drones at most. But when more blips appeared on screens, operators realized something far larger was coming. As the drones crossed into Bryansk region, local residents reported a loud buzzing sound, like a swarm of insects in the sky. The sound grew louder as dozens of drones skimmed across treetops, rooftops, and open fields. Many villagers were woken up by the noise, only to see glowing trails moving quickly through the night sky. Within seconds, air raid sirens were triggered in multiple towns. Russian air defenses scrambled to react, but the sheer volume of drones caused immediate chaos. Instead of a handful of targets, there were nearly 90 separate ones to track at once. Each had different altitude levels, speeds, and approach vectors. Some flew in clusters, while others came from opposite directions. For Russian operators, this was saturation warfare. Too many incoming threats to counter all at once. At 12:32 a.m., the first wave of drones reached the outskirts of the pipeline sector near Bojovo. The drones were not random off-the-shelf types. Ukraine had equipped them with military-grade warheads capable of penetrating steel casings, fuel tanks, and pumping stations. One by one, they closed in, circling around their target zone. Then, in a flash, the first impact occurred. A brilliant fireball shot upward into the fog, lighting up the night sky. The ground shook for miles as flames erupted from the mainline. Russia's billion-dollar defenses had just been pierced, and the attack was only beginning. For weeks before the strike, Ukrainian intelligence had been watching the pipeline carefully. They knew this $5.2 billion oil route was one of Russia's most important lifelines. The section near Tver and Bryansk carried more than 800,000 barrels of refined fuel every single day. This fuel did not just go to civilian markets. It powered Russian army vehicles, supply trucks, tanks, artillery units, and fighter jets. Cutting this flow would hit Russia's military power immediately. Ukrainian planners decided this was the perfect spot to launch a decisive strike. Satellite imagery from commercial providers like Maxar and military satellites from NATO allies confirmed unusual movements around the area in the days before. They noticed long lines of tanker trucks moving in and out of the pipeline junctions. They also spotted large storage tanks filled to capacity. To Ukrainian analysts, this meant that Russia had stockpiled a huge amount of fuel for future operations in eastern Ukraine. Taking out this supply before it reached the front lines would cripple upcoming Russian offensives. But Russia also knew this pipeline was a target. They deployed multiple layers of defenses around it. Pantsir S-1 mobile air defense vehicles were stationed nearby, each equipped with autocannons and short-range missiles. S-400 long-range missile batteries watched the skies for intruders. Krasuka-4 electronic warfare systems were installed to jam GPS signals and disrupt drone controls. Mi-28 Havoc gunships were tasked to patrol in circles, hunting for anything flying low to the ground. On paper, this made the pipeline nearly impossible to hit. Moscow described it as untouchable. Ukrainian officers, however, saw weaknesses in the system. The problem for Russia was the sheer length of the pipeline. It stretched for hundreds of miles. Covering every section with equal strength was not possible. Some areas were heavily defended, but others had gaps. Ukraine's electronic warfare units tested Russian jamming ranges in advance, flying small decoy drones into the area. They found spots where GPS jamming was weaker, where radar coverage was incomplete, and where air patrols were delayed. Each weakness was mapped and stored in Ukraine's digital targeting systems. When the time came to attack, drone pilots would know exactly where to send their swarms. By the morning of the attack, the plan was ready. Instead of sending 1 or 2 drones that could easily be intercepted, Ukraine would send nearly 90. The drones would not all strike at the same time. They were launched in waves, programmed to arrive in intervals. The first wave would act as decoys, drawing Russian fire and forcing operators to waste valuable interceptor missiles. The second and third waves would carry the real payloads, armed with shaped charges strong enough to pierce steel and ignite fuel. To make things harder for Russia, Ukraine also launched electronic interference drones that would blind radars for short bursts. These disruptions, even if lasting only seconds, could open corridors for real strikes. At the same time, Ukrainian special forces and intelligence operators monitored the entire event from command centers. They had live feeds from drones flying at high altitude, infrared images of fuel tanks glowing hot in the night, and communications intercepts of Russian defenses calling for reinforcements. Every detail was tracked, every movement recorded. When the pipeline finally came into view of the real strike drones, Ukrainian commanders gave a single order: proceed. The setup was complete. The trap was ready to spring. At 12:54 a.m., the operation began. The first wave of drones entered Russian airspace, flying low and fast. These were not the main strike drones, but decoys, about 20 of them. They were cheap plywood drones, loud and obvious, designed to be seen. Russian radar systems locked onto them instantly. S-400 missile batteries launched interceptor rockets, while Pantsir S-1 vehicles sprayed autocannon fire into the sky. In less than 2 minutes, the Russians destroyed most of the decoys. From their perspective, they thought the attack was finished. But this was only the beginning. While Russian defenses were busy firing at the decoys, the real strike wave was already moving in from another direction. Dozens of Liu-T long-range drones skimmed at just 130 feet above the ground. They used terrain to hide, flying through valleys, hugging forests, and following riverbeds. Their onboard systems did not rely on GPS alone. They used inertial navigation, meaning Russian jamming had no effect on their guidance. By the time Russian operators realized new targets were appearing on their radar screens, the drones were already minutes away from the pipeline. Russian electronic warfare units tried to respond. Krasuka-4 jammers blasted the area with interference, hoping to blind the drones. But Ukraine had anticipated this. Some of the drones carried their own counter-jamming systems, disrupting Russian frequencies in return. Others were programmed to fly preset routes, ignoring outside signals. Mi-28 Havoc helicopters scrambled to intercept, firing rockets and cannon shells at shadows in the night. They managed to shoot down a handful, but too many drones slipped through. For every 1 drone destroyed, 3 more advanced. The first real impact came at 1:10 a.m. 1 drone slammed into a mainline valve chamber along the pipeline near Bojovo. The shaped charge warhead punched through steel plating and detonated the pressure controls inside. The explosion ruptured the valve and caused fuel to gush out in massive streams. Just seconds later, another drone hit a nearby pumping station, its warhead igniting fuel stored in steel reservoirs. Flames erupted instantly, climbing into the sky. The third and fourth strikes followed quickly. 1 drone tore into a junction point where multiple smaller pipelines connected, causing a chain of ruptures. Another targeted a secondary storage facility, setting fuel tanks on fire. Within seconds, the quiet Russian countryside turned into a firestorm. Local residents described hearing loud booms, windows shaking, and the night sky turning orange. By 1:25 a.m., the Russian air defense network was in chaos. Operators on the ground shouted over radios, reporting multiple impacts and fires. Panzer vehicles continued firing, but were running low on missiles. Mi-28 helicopters circled desperately, but smoke and flames obscured their view. Officials later claimed that 70 drones were destroyed, but satellite imagery captured by independent analysts showed the truth. Several drones had made direct hits, and the pipeline was burning. The first impacts created cascading secondary explosions. Fuel under pressure burst through ruptured casings, igniting instantly. Pipelines split open for nearly 200 meters. Fireballs shot upward, rising hundreds of feet into the air. The blaze was so intense that NASA satellites recorded the heat signature from space. Russia's billion-dollar defense shield had failed, and the world could see it. By 1:35 a.m., the scale of the destruction was undeniable. The $5.2 billion oil pipeline, which Russia had long described as safe and secure, was now in flames. Analysts later estimated that more than 25 to 30% of the pipeline's supply capacity was lost in a single night. This pipeline had been moving over 800,000 barrels of refined fuel daily, much of it sent to Russia's western military district to power tanks, armored vehicles, and fighter jets. With it crippled, Russia's frontline fuel supply was suddenly in crisis. Military units that depended on this steady flow of diesel and jet fuel were left vulnerable. Logistics officers scrambled to reroute supplies from Belarus and other depots, but the sudden shortage caused immediate delays in frontline operations. Repair crews rushed to the site as fires raged. Dozens of emergency workers were deployed, but the inferno was too intense. For more than 12 hours, flames continued to spread across broken sections of the pipeline. Columns of black smoke rose high into the sky, visible from over 30 miles away. Local residents were evacuated as shockwaves damaged homes and power lines. Roads were blocked, communication towers were taken offline, and the surrounding countryside looked like a war zone. Russian state television attempted to downplay the damage, reporting only minor fires and successful defenses. But independent satellite images told the truth. Wide sections of the pipeline were ripped apart, pumping stations destroyed, and storage tanks turned into molten wreckage. The financial impact was severe. Experts estimated that the immediate physical damage cost over $300 million. On top of that, Russia lost more than $1 billion worth of fuel due to fires and ruptured tanks. The blow to Russia's energy sector was huge, as this pipeline was not just a military lifeline, but also a commercial artery. Exports were disrupted, contracts delayed, and global oil markets reacted quickly. Fuel prices inside Russia spiked by 35 to 40% within days. For Moscow, this was more than just a military setback. It was a political and economic humiliation. Strategically, the attack demonstrated how Ukraine could turn relatively cheap drones into devastating weapons against billion-dollar infrastructure. The drones used in the strike were estimated to cost no more than $15,000 each, yet they brought down one of Russia's most valuable energy assets, worth billions. This cost imbalance sent a message not only to Moscow, but to the world. In modern warfare, technology and timing can outweigh expensive defenses. Despite Russia's layers of S-400s, Panzer systems, and electronic warfare units, a well-planned drone swarm still got through. The psychological impact was just as important. For years, Moscow told its people that critical energy sites were untouchable, protected by the most advanced defenses. This strike shattered that image. Videos of the burning pipeline spread across social media, showing Russian citizens that their leaders could not guarantee safety. Panic spread among local communities, and even loyal supporters began asking how a swarm of drones could defeat billion-dollar systems. The fear was not just about this one strike. It was about the realization that every pipeline, every depot, every refinery could now be targeted. The message was clear. Ukraine had turned Russia's energy empire into a battlefield. No target was too deep, no facility too valuable. By proving that 89 drones could cripple a $5.2 billion pipeline, Ukraine showed the world that Russia's war machine was vulnerable at its core. For the Kremlin, it was a brutal warning. Fuel your war, and your lifeline will burn.